welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Douglas Fowler, and I'm the Policy Manager at the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan. And in my work and in the work of our organization over the past number of months, I don't think there's been an issue of more importance than the question of the marketing environment and how it's changing. And as we move forward from having a single desk seller of wheat and barley towards an open market, we've been actively involved in promoting information and learning about that new marketing environment. We co-sponsored with the University of Saskatchewan in August a transportation symposium which brought together infrastructure and transportation experts from around the province to talk about the impact of Bill C-18. And we had a similar kind of meeting with a number of key stakeholders in February to discuss the issues as well. And we felt that apart from the transportation areas, there was some need to answer unanswered questions around marketing, particularly the contracting of wheat and barley as we move into this new marketing environment. So in discussions with members of the Agricultural Economics Department, the new phrase is a little too long for me to get my head around. We decided to partner with them to promote more information about contracting of wheat and barley. And we have with us today James Loken, who is a professor of Ag Econ, research associate in Ag Econ at the University of Saskatchewan, who's been instrumental in partnering with us along with Ken Rosasson, a professor there, to put on this conference. And having said that, I think the first point of departure on this is the fact that our guest speaker introduced the project that we've undertaken on market prospects, not this Saturday, but the Saturday before. And you may have had a chance to catch his remarks on that broadcast. And I'll point you to James at the back with his computer, because he's hoping to have up access to the market prospects site where you'd be able to watch and listen to Dr. Olson's remarks, and also other aspects of that market prospects agenda for the year and the upcoming events that they're sponsoring. And you can find it at marketprospects.usask.ca. So what we decided to do in the end was have a multiple type of project, starting with the market prospects and moving into 3 country meetings, of which this is the first, and we're hoping to end up with more presentations ultimately at the Farming for Profit conference in Moose Jaw on the 24th of June. All of this is made possible, this project entirely made possible by the application we made to and the funding support we got from the Agriculture Council of Saskatchewan. And this funding actually came through an older program called CARD, so we really appreciate their support for this. And for today's agenda, we have kind of 2 parts. The first part is to try to talk a little bit more generally about grain marketing in an open environment from the perspective of the United States, where they've been doing this forever for wheat and barley, but also to talk a bit about contracts specifically. And then after coffee, we're going to have a presentation from the Canadian Wheat Board about the contracts that they have available and that they announced on Thursday of last week. So we're very pleased to have an expert in the area, not only on market prospects, but with us for the next 3 days. Dr. Frayne Olson specializes in crop marketing and risk management at North Dakota State University, with collaborative work in agribusiness management and farm management. In 2007, he completed his PhD in agricultural economics at the University of Missouri and then worked in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University until August 2008, where he conducted outreach programs for marketing and farm supply cooperatives and agricultural producers. Dr. Olson has also farmed for many years in eastern North Dakota, and we're delighted to have him here to talk about marketing of wheat and barley in general and contracts related to that in particular. Dr. Frayne Olson.
All right, thank you. We have, there we go, the PA system. Microphone's adjusted. And let's see if my button works. Oh, can you flip it on? There we go. Well, good afternoon. We're going to make this as interactive as possible, okay? I have a lot of stuff that I can talk about, but the most important thing is to talk about what you're interested in. So I do have a few comments, a few things I'd like to introduce, and in particular give you a better perspective of what happens in the U.S. What does the U.S. marketing system look like? What are some of the key factors that might be influencing it? And I think the general consensus, or the general outlook right now is that as the Canadian system begins to adjust, it will begin to look more and more like the U.S. system. Whether that's true or not, we'll have to wait and see, but I do want to give you an idea of what the U.S. system looks like and what are some of the key issues we're trying to address and focus on. Oh, I got to turn this on. There we go. So I briefly want to give a quick overview of some of the dynamics in the U.S. marketing system, okay, and some of the things that are in particular that affect wheat, spring wheat in particular, durum, and barley, because I know that's some of the core issues that you're concerned about. I also want to discuss specifically some of the contracting and contract options that we have here in the States, okay? And understand how they might be similar or different from the system that you're familiar with. Also, I want to talk a little bit about marketing strategies, how the futures market can potentially play a role as we move forward. And again, depending on how all this evolves and how the contracts out of the ICE exchange in Winnipeg become more popular or dissolve, one of the two, it'll be very interesting to watch. And that, I think, at the end of the day, will provide a lot of opportunities for those that are willing to take a little bit of time to learn what's going on. And most importantly, trying to answer your questions. So if there's something that I say as we're going along, please interrupt, holler out, raise your hand, jump up and down, do some cartwheels. I'll try and call on you and see if we can get the answers to your questions. Okay. As I get rolling here, one of the things I want to start with is understand the role that spring wheat, durum, and barley play in the U.S. marketing system. If you look at planted acreage, corn and soybeans are the king. And a lot of things that happen in corn and beans influence wheat. Now I understand that, and I know very well because we still grow a lot of canola in North Dakota, anyway, where I'm at. The soybean market and the canola market are linked because they're common oilseeds. So what happens in soybeans influences canola and vice versa. But for right now, in the North American agriculture, corn is king. Corn is the one that's really been driving a lot of the price movements and a lot of the attention. And the reason is because it is such a large and dominant crop, in particular in the United States. So if you look at it on an acreage basis, this is what it looks like in the U.S. And also understanding, if we look at wheat in the U.S., we've got 6 different classes. I only have 5 of them listed here, but 6 different classes of wheat. Okay, we have hard red winter wheat, which is primarily grown in the southern plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. We have hard red spring wheat, which is dominant in North Dakota and Montana. We have soft red winter wheat, which is dominant in the kind of the Ohio River Valley, if you get into southern Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, kind of the eastern portion. We have white wheat, and the 2 subclasses of white wheat. Most of that is grown out in the Pacific Northwest, in particular in Oregon and Washington State. And then we have durum. Look at how tiny durum is in the U.S. wheat market. I know in Canada that's just opposite. Durum is a dominant crop when it comes to one of the dominant crops. So when we talk about wheat in the United States, we have to be a bit careful. Are you talking about wheat as a general complex? Or are we talking about wheat as a specific subclass? Are we talking winter wheat, spring wheat, durum? What are we talking about? Okay, so we have to understand that. The other thing that I want to point out, of course, is we have futures markets in the U.S. for some of these classes of wheat, but not for all of them. For corn, we have Chicago Board of Trade. For soybeans, we also have Chicago Board of Trade. When we talk about Chicago wheat, we're actually talking about soft red winter wheat as a subclass. That's what's traded there, even though that has the largest trading volume. The Minneapolis Grain Exchange, or the Minneapolis market, is for hard red spring wheat. So when we look at the different futures prices for wheat, when we say Minneapolis wheat, that's really, we're talking primarily spring wheat. And the Chicago Board of Trade, the Kansas City Board of Trade, excuse me, which is in Kansas City, Kansas, is trading hard red winter wheat. And of all the classes, hard red winter wheat is the largest when you look at the number of bushels. So let's look at bushels first. So this is acreage, number of acres we planted each of these crops. Here's bushels. Okay, this is the number of bushels produced last year. The current forecast is to have much larger corn numbers. Soybean and wheat numbers will stay about the same. One of the reasons that in the U.S. we spend so much time talking about corn is that is the dominant crop. And right now we're the most tight on corn. And again, to put this in perspective, ethanol use in the United States is also one of those big topics we spend a lot of time talking about. Why is ethanol use such a big deal? Because right now, we're going to use more in the U.S., more corn for ethanol production than we will for feed, which is the first time in history. And if you count bushels, if you take all the soybean bushels produced in the U.S. and all the wheat bushels produced in the U.S. and add them together, you get about the amount of corn that's going to be used in ethanol. About 5 billion bushels. So I'm not going to spend much time, other than what you've just heard, I'm not going to spend much time talking about corn and ethanol. Most of my time is going to be talking about wheat, durum, and malt barley. But I want to put things in perspective when we're counting bushels. Wheat doesn't get the attention that it does here in Canada, in the United States. Now if you look at total bushels, and crude rules of thumb, just to put things in perspective again, if you look at all wheat, the U.S. produces about twice the number of bushels of wheat that Canada does, give or take. If you look at spring wheat only, Canada produces about 50% more spring wheat in bushels than we do here in the States. When it looks at durum, in Canada produces anywhere from 1.7 to 2 times the durum that the United States does. Okay, so the core crops for you folks are slightly different than the core crops we have in the United States. And I just want to put that in context as we move forward, because as we move into the discussion on futures and futures market trading, corn becomes a more relevant topic. So, crop contracting is very common in the United States. Almost every farmer has signed some form of contract, whether it be for small market crops, especially crops like field peas, lentils, or whether it be for the major crops like corn, soybeans, spring wheat, and durum. They're all using contracts in one way, shape, or form. The thing we have to understand is that the contracts we use for large market crops like corn, beans, spring wheat are structured differently than they are for the small market crops, like in the U.S., like again, field pea, lentil, durum, malt barley, sunflower. Okay, there are differences in the way they're structured and some of the things that we have to be looking at. So let me ask you a question, try and get some discussion going here. Why do farmers contract? Why do grain buyers contract? Why do we even talk about this stuff? I mean, I'm sure you guys are contracting field pea and lentil, probably contracting some canola. Why do you do that?
Price hedging.
Price hedging. You're trying to lock in a price. What are some other reasons?
Delivery opportunity.
Delivery opportunities. We're trying to manage inventories. We only have so much bin space on the farm, right? What are some other ones? How about spreading some workload out? Right? There's lots of different... How about from a buyer's perspective? Why would a buyer want to contract? Supply. They want to make sure that they get what they need, right? So one of them is simply probably the most important is to reduce risk. From a farmer's perspective, it's to say, well, I've at least locked in a price on some of my production. From a buyer's standpoint, they're looking at it and saying, look, I want to make sure that I have the correct crop. That I get the kind of crop grown that I need to be able to merchandise or to be able to use within my system. Okay, the other one, which I'm going to spend quite a bit more time talking about, is a communication tool. How do you as a farmer know specifically what the end user or the buyers want? How do you know whether they want particular variety? I mean, in the malt barley industry, there are certain varieties that the maltsters love. and there's certain varieties that the maltsters hate. So how does the malting company, if they're looking for a particular variety, communicate to you guys saying, we want you to grow this variety, not this variety? How do we do that? How do we tell that to you?
Premiums.
Premiums. Absolutely. They can specify in the contract saying, all right, we're going to offer you this price, but in order to get this price, you have to grow these varieties specifically. And guess what? You're going to have to deliver those varieties to these locations because that's where we have our receiving sites. Okay? So it's not only talking about price, which I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, but it's also quality and quantity. How much are they willing to buy? How far are you willing to forward contract, not knowing exactly how many bushels you're going to grow? So why do we study contracts? And this is, I spend a lot of time in part of my job at the university talking about contracting and contracts, contract design, what are the things we need to be concerned about. And the reason I spend so much time talking about this stuff is because, you know what? This is a moving target. Things are always changing, all right? And understand that the contracts in one industry are very different from the contracts in another. So for example, sunflower and canola contracts are very different from pea and lentil contracts, which are very different from corn and bean contracts. Not a big shock to anybody. What you're going to find out though is there's also considerable variability across a company. So companies, even though they're buying and selling essentially the same group of products, are going to structure their contracts, potentially structure their contracts very differently. The final thing is that it is changing every year. So just because you've worked with one company for several years over and over and over again, doesn't mean that they haven't made additions or changes, modifications to their contracts. Because no contract is complete, meaning you can't put everything you possibly need to know into a contract. It'd be 6 feet deep and nobody signed the thing anyway, right? So what you do is you put in what are the key clauses, what are the main things that are going on. Now I know last year, at least in North Dakota, we had a tremendous amount of prevented plant. It just got so wet we couldn't get the crop planted. I will assure you, this year, coming in 2012, these grain companies have modified their contracts to be more specific about how are we going to treat prevented plant. It's like, oh, we never thought of that. We're going to have to put that into the contract for next year. So these things are kind of evolving or moving targets. And my greatest concern for farmers in particular is that they become somewhat complacent. Okay, they see the high prices that are being offered in the contracts and say, man, this is a great deal, sign me up. And they don't spend enough time reading some of the details to say, okay, what do I have to do to be able to get that price that's quoted in the contract? So let's talk a little bit about this. And I want to understand that there's contracts that are the full breadth of a wide range of things. There's all the way from what I'm going to call marketing contracts to production contracts and everything in between. This is not a nice, clean, this fits into this bucket, this fits into this bucket. Okay, there's kind of a continuum. So let's look at the difference. When I mention a marketing contract, and again, this is kind of the academic talk coming out, so be patient with me, I'll get to the fun stuff in a minute. When we talk about marketing contracts, we're really looking at those things for very generic commodities that have futures markets to it. So think of a corn contract, a soybean contract, a general canola contract. Okay, we do specify price, we do specify quantity, how many hundredweight or how many bushels are we talking about? We do specify quality, at least minimum quality specifications. But you as the seller, you as the farmer have a lot of discretion in how you grow that crop and what you do. Okay, you can plant any seed variety you want to, you can have any production system you want to, you can deliver it whenever you choose to deliver it, as long as it meets the quality specifications. Now these are usually in place for crops that have already been grown. You've got the grain in the bin, you're just trying to set the price on it, okay? And again, the futures markets allow a lot of flexibility to be able to be somewhat creative in how we structure these contracts. It'll leave you a lot of flexibility, okay? On the other end of the continuum is the production contracts. When I say production contract, what I'm talking about, again, we are establishing price, we're talking about qualities, we're talking about quantities, but in this case, the buyer or the end user is putting a lot of stipulations in. We don't need just generic stuff, we want something special. Okay, now all of a sudden, just like in the malt barley contracts, we want specific varieties. We don't want to, we will take delivery when we want delivered, not necessarily when you want to deliver it. They'll have windows of opportunity that you can deliver it. We're not going to talk general grade standards. We have very specific grade standards for our usage. We don't want the generic stuff anymore. These are typically for those crops that haven't been produced yet. So you're signing those right now so that you know what kind of seed varieties you have to plant, etc. And these are really, really common in those small market crops, those specialty crops. The best example I can come up in North Dakota is food grade soybeans. They're not generic soybeans, but they're food grade soybeans. They're used for specific purposes. Another example would be, for example, Nexera canola, the high oleic stuff. Okay, generic canola and high oleic canola are different animals. So what are some of the common quality standards? What are some of the common quality things that we see in the United States? Now, I'm going to go through by commodity. Some of these are going to be very similar to the Canadian system, the Canadian grain standards. But some of them will be a little bit different. And understand that a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are not necessarily USDA standards. These are buyer-specific or company standards that are being put in place. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of them. Let's talk about hard red spring wheat. One of the differences in the US system versus the Canadian system, as a farmer, most elevators have a website that I can go to and look up and say, okay, what's the price they're offering today? And on that website, if you look on the internet, and again, most of them have this, they're going to specify saying, okay, here's the Minneapolis futures price, and here's the basis, what we're going to subtract for local prices, and then here's your local cash price in the bid that you're going to go to. So we start with the futures price, which is a standardized price with a standardized quality. We subtract out the basis, or that spread between cash prices and futures prices based on where I'm located in the state or within the region. And then we start taking the quality adjustments from there. So when you look at it on the websites, be a little bit careful when they quote a price. What quality are they quoting a price for? Okay? Now, the reason they do that, and again, the futures market provides a lot of flexibility, not only for farmers, but also for the grain merchandisers, for the end users, to be able to shed risk, especially price risk. Saying, all right, I want to lock something in today, but if prices change on me, I don't want to get caught on the wrong end of this. Okay, so that's one of the main uses for the futures market. So let's talk specifically then about take the futures price less the basis, and again that varies depending upon location. Now let's talk about some of the other adjustments that can take place. Now most of this is going to be very standard, and I put everything on dollars per bushel, and most of the information that I have here is literally directly from websites of different elevators across North Dakota. Okay, especially when it comes to the actual dollar amounts. And I'm going to talk about the variability or the changes that can go on in these premiums and discounts, because there's a lot of volatility in that as well. So for spring wheat, the minimum is 58 pounds. Now 60 pounds is the base. Okay, that's not going to be any different than Canadian system. 58 pounds is the minimum. If you get lighter test weight, they're going to start to be some discounts. And again, I just put these discounts up because these will change over time. They can change from one year to the next. They can change from one day to the next. But they're not terribly volatile. They're not something that changes on a really rapid basis. But I did pull these off of one of the websites of the local elevators, and they have that available. They post it up. It's very transparent. You can see what's going on. For foreign material, FM. That's everything else that isn't wheat. It's not necessarily dockage, but it would be like rocks and miscellaneous pieces of stuff. Kernel damage, that would be something like sprout damage. It would be heat damage because you stored it in the bin too long. You had some problems. Okay. Falling numbers. This is an interesting one. This is one that's kind of unique to the United States. If you look at the USDA Federal Grain Inspection Standards, falling numbers is nowhere on there. You have test weight, you have damaged kernels. That's all in the standardized system. Falling numbers is not. Anybody heard of falling numbers test before? A handful of people? So what is a falling numbers test? It's a test for sprout damage. It's a test to see has sprouting begun in the seed. And in the US we have sprout damage, which is where you physically see the little green tip showing out of the top of the kernel, right? But the industry has found out, and the millers, the grain milling industry has said, you know what? By the time you get that green tip going on, there's big problems. We can't use it, period. So there was a test that was developed, actually a driveway test that you can use in the elevator, to say, has the sprouting process begun? So if you have a really wet, rainy fall, more than likely they'll start testing for this. If you have a beautiful fall where it's nice and dry and there aren't any problems, more than likely the elevator is not going to test for it. But what it is it's essentially a test to see has the sprouting process begun. Because what is the flour mills after? They're after the carbohydrate part. They're after the starch part, right? If the sprouting takes place, that starch and the protein begin to break down. It isn't very good for bread production. It isn't very good for pasta production. Okay, so this is a test to see, is there a problem? Now right now, we had a beautiful fall. Very little rain, everything came off in beautiful shape. Nobody's testing for falling numbers. If we were to have a very wet fall, a lot of rain, a lot of drizzle, a lot of fog, I will guarantee you they will start testing for, at least in North Dakota, they will start testing for falling numbers. If the standard, the key is the 300 number. If it's 300 or better, you're fine, you're golden, no problem. If it gets below 300, then all of a sudden some discounts appear. So let me ask you a question. This is 5 cents for every 10 points under 300. That's actually pretty manageable. There have been times, there have been years, especially if we got a lot of sprout damage, where that discount has jumped substantially. Has really risen. It's not 5 cents, it's 15 cents. Okay, so let me ask you a question. If pretend you're an elevator manager, put an elevator manager hat on for just a minute. Let's pretend that you have just a little bit of some problems, some poor quality stuff, some poor quality wheat. You got a whole bunch of really good quality wheat. What do you do? What do you do with that little poor quality stuff? Blend it off. Absolutely. In fact, in the grain merchandising industry, especially for spring wheat, blending is an encouraged thing because they want consistency. Okay, so if you've got a little bit of really bad stuff and a whole bunch of good stuff, you just blend it off. You're very careful how you do it, but you meet the standards. So what happens now if you have a whole bunch of really bad stuff and a little bit of good stuff? Now what do you do? What's that? Make vodka. I asked that question at a meeting in North Dakota once, and there was an elevator manager sitting in the back row, and he said, "Cry." You got problems, right? What you do is you have to find a different market. And if you talk to the elevator industry, what they're going to say is, you know what? Getting rid of the good stuff. Marketing the good stuff is really simple. That's easy. Everybody wants it. It's trying to get rid of or market the poor stuff that separates the men from the boys. That'll make you the money or not make you the money. It's how do you handle this off-quality product? Well, in order to find that, or in order to find a market for it and be able to get rid of it, if you have a problem, more than likely a bunch of other people have a problem, which means that those industries that can use some wheat that has some damage to it are suddenly getting flooded and inundated with all this kind of stuff. They can buy more than they can ever use. So what happens to the price of the poor quality stuff? It keeps going down. They keep discounting it until they find some other uses for it. Okay, so that's why this qualities, these premiums and discounts thing get to be such a big deal. In some years, you're not going to notice any difference. And in other years, they're going to be a huge deal. It's going to be a big, big thing. Vomitoxin, Dawn. You guys had some of that stuff? Oh yeah, most of us have, right? If you've farmed the last 10 or 15 years, you've had to deal with this at some point in time. The same thing with Dawn. If you have a year where there's very little vomitoxin problems, yeah, you'll have some discounts for it, but it goes through the system because everybody can blend it off. If everybody and their brother has Dawn problems, what do you think is going to happen to that discount schedule? It's going to get wider and wider and wider, right? So that they're going to take more and more of a discount. Why? It's not that the grain companies are trying to, jip you out of something. It's just they're having a really hard time trying to get rid of it. Who can use this? And that's what they're trying to figure out. Again, getting rid of the high quality stuff is really easy. Getting rid of the poor quality stuff is tough. Moisture content, and again, this is pretty much standard stuff. 13.5 is the standard in the US. If you have more than that, you got some drying charges, nothing new there. Let me talk about proteins. In the United States, 14% protein is the standard. That's the base. Now, if you look specifically at the futures market contract out of Minneapolis, they specify 13.5 pro. And my understanding is that the ICE contract out of Winnipeg is also 13.5 pro as the base. The cash market, the industry in the US, is based off of 14. That's where we start. The premiums and discounts go up and down from there. I'm going to show you some charts in a minute how volatile these premiums and discounts can be. So understand again, just like any other quality attribute, if everybody has really high quality, high protein wheat, what do you think is going to happen to the premiums for high protein wheat? They're going to go almost to zero. If nobody has high protein wheat, what do you think is going to happen to the protein premiums? They're going to go nuts. Also understand, and I want to be very, very specific here, the wheat industry is actually a very complex system. And because wheat, and in particular spring wheat and durum, are so quality sensitive, the buyers are very sophisticated in what they're looking for. That's why when you look at a wheat contract, it's going to look very different than a standard canola contract. Because the end user is saying, this is what I want. This is what I'm looking for. Okay, but also understand that the export market is looking for different things than the domestic market, at least in the United States. Domestic millers are looking for slightly different things than some of the export markets. And even different export companies or export, for example, the spring wheat sold into Japan, they have different criteria and standards than the spring wheat that's sold into Europe. They're looking for different things. So we can't generalize and say wheat is wheat. And the wheat market is the wheat market. We actually have to start thinking about sub-markets. So who's looking for this quality wheat versus this quality wheat? And in the past, the Canadian Wheat Board has been in Canada anyway, has been the group that has helped manage that. You as farmers haven't seen a lot of what's going on behind the scenes. As you transition to a system that looks more like the US system, even though there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff going on, it's more transparent because each of these premiums and discounts are priced separately. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about protein spreads. In the US, and I've done some work in this area, the protein premiums and discounts in the US, I've tried to get local elevator data for this. Okay, and it is out there, it's available, but it's really, really hard and expensive to accumulate because 9 times out of 10, the elevator has it in a 3-ring binder in the back room and said, well, you want historical stuff, go dig for it. I don't have the time to do that. Fortunately, USDA, US Department of Agriculture, keeps price records for major terminal elevators. These are major points of departure. One of them is Portland, Oregon. That's a major export terminal, just like Vancouver. Okay, to be the parallel to Vancouver. So this is really an export market. And what I did was I looked at, and they report daily prices. So I took the daily price for 13 Pro, 14 Pro, and 15 Pro spring wheat delivered to Portland. So this would be the price that the elevators get, not the price that you would get. Okay, so if an elevator is trying to decide, do I ship it to Portland or do I ship it to Minneapolis, these are the prices they look at. And all I did was I subtracted those 3 prices. I said, what's the differential between 13, 14, and 15 Pro wheat? So the line running right through the middle here is the price for 14 Pro. Okay? The blue line on top is the premium offered for 15. The discount is what's offered for 13. And understand the scaling goes, if you're at 14.1, you get a premium, 14.2 you get a premium, and it's all prorated. I just used the 13, 14, 15 to give you an idea. This goes from June 1 of 1999 through last week. Look at how volatile that is. Especially these last couple of years over here. Now what does that look like? What do you see in that picture really quick? What's the real story in this one? Not only is it volatile, but what? They tend to open and close together, right? When one goes up, the other goes down. They're almost mirror images of each other. So why is it these last couple of years things have changed so dramatically? Well, there's a reason for that. Let's take this same, let me back up one. Let's take this same information and put it on marketing year basis. So instead of just looking at a long time horizon, let's just look at the marketing year. So the marketing year for wheat in the United States starts on June 1. The reason for June 1 is because that's when the winter wheat starts to be harvested. I know this is a really ugly thing, and I showed most of the years here. I'm going to strip those out. Here are the years that I want to focus on. Here's 2008, 9, 10, 11. Okay, to 2011, that's the crop we just harvested in the States. Before harvest, this is harvest time period here, right? In August, September. Just before harvest in 2008, we had about a 10-cent discount from 13 to 14, or 14 down to 13. And these prices are actually very, very close to what the local elevators are offering to farmers in western North Dakota, which would be, kind of east central Saskatchewan, geographically. So these are very, very close to what the local, because I've been following this for a while. Right at harvest, there seems to be an adjustment here, right? So we go back. 2008, we went from just a few cents under to what? About 80-cent differential. That's 80 cents per bushel. And then it kind of flattened out, bounced around for a while, then all of a sudden we came to 2009 at about 60 under, and all of a sudden, boom, it dropped to $1.40 under. And it kind of bounced around between about $1.40 and $1.80. We come across here to 2010, it bounced around a little bit more, started softening even worse. Then now we're down at $1.80. A substantial discount for 13 Pro, and all of a sudden, boom, it pops back up again. Kind of drifts along, and now we've had a drifting roller and then pop back up again. So what's going on in this time period? It's harvest for spring wheat, right? So let me show you a graph. Okay, here's the premiums. Excuse me, I got ahead of myself. Here's the premiums. These are almost identical, right? So you happen to grow 15 Pro instead of 14. Here's the premium you'd get. So those guys that had, those few guys out there that had high protein wheat really benefited in 2009 and 2010. So what happened in 2009 and 10? This is every fall, the commodity organizations, the wheat groups in North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana get together and do a survey of the quality of the spring wheat. Okay, and they report this just after harvest. So this is the number of samples, the percent of the samples, and there's about 400 samples a year that come in for testing. About 35 to 45% of the protein of the samples coming in were 15 Pro or better. And again, 14 is the base. We have a few of them here that came in below 12. 2008, very similar numbers. We tend to have a lot of higher protein wheat, especially in the western part of the growing region, western North Dakota, eastern Montana. Then all of a sudden we hit 2009. Look what happened to the average proteins. The average stayed about the same. Here's our 14s. We're a definite shortage of 15 plus. And all of a sudden we came to 2010. We have a real shortage of high protein wheat. And all of a sudden we hit 2011. We pop back up again. Do you think there's a relationship between the amount of high protein wheat out there and those protein spreads? Absolutely. Absolutely. So is it that the grain companies are trying to manipulate the system? No, they're just trying to reflect what's going on in the system. So I know farmers in North Dakota, anyway, I got a lot of phone calls in 2008, 2009, or 2009 and 10 saying, what in the thunder has happened? Why have all of a sudden these protein spreads? The 1 year I have a lot of bushels of low protein, I get discounted to heck for it. Well, the problem is everybody else had the same problem. Everybody else had really good yields and very low protein, and so what happens is we got a shortage of high protein wheat and everybody's starting out there bidding for it. We've got a lot of low protein wheat in the system. Real quick, I just want to show Minneapolis. And the reason I want to show Minneapolis is that's more of a domestic market. So Portland is an export market, right? Minneapolis, there's some export business, but it's really a domestic market. This is the same graph for Minneapolis. What do you see that's different? What's different about this versus Portland? Look right in here, that's the hint.
Higher premiums protein.
The premiums are much higher than the discounts. Before they were almost equal, right? The premiums and discounts were almost equal. Here we've got a real big premium for high protein and not too much of a discount for low protein. Why is that? Anybody have a theory?
They needed the volume of the lower protein to blend with the high protein that was available.
Okay, you got it partially right. So that if I understood, it had to do with the volume of low protein versus high protein, and that's exactly right. So two things. Number one, the domestic market, 13.5 protein is okay. They'd like 14, but they can deal with 13.5. Okay, the second thing is, I said earlier, where's all the high protein wheat grown? In the western growing regions. Where's Minneapolis located? In the east. So what happens is the Minneapolis market has to pull a lot harder to get that grain to flow east into Minneapolis than it automatically goes west into the export market. Okay? So depending on who needs it and how badly they need it, we can see these spreads change. So again, the growers in the east that tend to have higher yields and lower proteins, they're discounted for it, but they're not discounted as hard as the guys out west. which tend to have a little bit lower yields and much higher proteins, because that's where everybody looks for protein, is out west. Okay? How about barley? Do malt barley? Ah, okay, I see some heads. Yeah, okay, let's talk about malt barley. The malt companies, of all the commodities we grow in North Dakota, malt barley is the most quality sensitive. And the malt industry is very, in particular, a couple of companies are very particular about what they're looking for. They have some very attractive contracts out there, very high prices, but they're very specific. You've got to be very good to meet their quality specs and to get that price. So let's talk just a little bit about that. Again, test weight, 48 pounds is the standard. You have to have minimum 45. Skinned and broken, that's just a matter of thrashing. Moisture content, you've got to be careful there. Proteins are just the opposite, of course. From malt barley, you want low protein, not high protein like in spring wheat. Germination, 96, plump and thin. Most of these contract specifications are detailed in the contract. They say, here's the minimums. All right, here's one of the keys. Most malt companies have the varieties that they prefer grown. Now, there are a standard list that's acceptable to the industry, but each company has their preferred varieties. So just understand that. This is one that has caught more farmers than anything else, at least in North Dakota, is this vomitoxin or Don content. And depending upon the company, some of them will reject at 2 parts per million. Say if it's over 2 parts, we don't even want it. Other companies will say, well, we'll take up to 4 or 5 parts per million, but after 1, we're going to start discounting. So it all depends upon the company and what they're trying to do and how desperate they are to get their grain. This is the other part that you've got to understand about most malt barley contracts. This is called buyer's call. Meaning you grow it, you put it in a bin, you send them in a sample so they know what the quality is, and we'll call you up and tell you when you can deliver. Okay? I know that sounds kind of like the Canadian Wheat Board, but sometimes there's farmers have waited a long, long time for it to get delivered, and there's no advance payments on this. So you grow it, and you stick it in the bin, and it may sit there for 6, 8, 12 months before you can deliver, and you don't get paid until after you deliver. And if there's any kind of quality change as it's in the bin, that's your risk. That's the risk that you bear. The other thing is, what happens if you signed a contract, let's say you kind of signed a contract for 20,000 bushels, and you grew 100,000. If you read the contract specifications very carefully, they'll say that, well, even though we priced the first 20, we have the right of first refusal on the remaining 80. So if it's really good quality stuff, we want the first chance to buy it. And we'll pay you market going price, and we have to pay market price in the going rate. But we get the first cut at it. And you have to have a signed release before you can go to another company. So just be a little bit careful of some of these clauses. That they're not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to say they're a bad thing, but they do come with some strings. So understand what those strings are. So what type of grain contracts use the futures market? The ones I've talked about so far are cash market contracts. I've got to be careful. Standing in the wrong spot here for feedback. What about futures market contracts? How does the futures market work? What's the deal here? What's the big excitement? What's the big noise about? This is a chart of the prices for spring wheat in North Dakota and in Minneapolis. So the red line is the actual cash price in Minot. Anybody know what Minot is? That's the Souris River. That's the town that got flooded here recently, right? All right. I won't tell you what they think of your Canadian water. That's supposed to be a joke. I'm just kidding. All right. The different multicolored lines here are the different futures months. So again, the futures contract is a contract for delivery in the future. And these contracts are standardized. The only thing that changes in the futures market contract is the price. Everything else is standardized. Okay, and this is for delivery of grain at different times in the futures. Now the point you've got to understand is 99.9% of the time the futures market is never delivered on. So the contracts you buy and sell in the futures market are not for cash grain. Okay? They're offset. So if you buy it now, you can sell it back 2 minutes from now. And what happens is you gain or lose based on the price change. And the weird thing is you can sell a contract before you buy it back. The old rule of marketing. Marketing's simple, right? Buy low, sell high. What else do you need to know? Okay, so if you think the price is going to go up, you buy it low, you wait a little while, and you resell the contract for later on, and when the price changes, you make money. If the price changes in the wrong way, you lose money. So the futures market is not, the contracts traded in the futures market are not for cash delivery. These are for future delivery, and 99.9% of the time they're offset. But they're used for sharing risk, or shifting risk away from a farmer into somebody else that wants it, as well as to try and establish a price. Remember I said in spring week, we take the futures price and we start subtracting stuff off? That's how we price things in the US. Well, depending upon when you think you're going to deliver, the elevator manager is going to pick one of these months as the basis point, or as the point of reference. The reason for showing this graph is look at how closely the cash market and the futures market follow each other. And literally, again, this is from January of 2010 through last Friday. So again, the red line is the actual cash market price, and all these multicolored lines are the different futures market prices. So what is basis? I already told you a little bit. What is basis? You know how you define basis? If you look at a textbook, what's the marketing textbook going to say? Anybody?
It's the time value of the difference between 1 month and the next month or down the road.
Very close, very close. Okay, what you're talking about is the time value or the difference between the different trading months. Okay, and those are, technically those are called spreads. Okay, and those are important. We can follow those. They tell us some information about what the market thinks is going to happen next. But technically the basis, when you're thinking about it from a farmer marketing standpoint, it's the difference between your local cash price and the futures price. So we got two different markets. We have the futures market for future delivery, and we got the market today for delivery and actual buying and selling cash grain. And the basis is simply that difference. Right? Why does that basis occur? Again, I'm going to use Minneapolis as an example. You can scratch Minneapolis and put Winnipeg in there if you wish. But there's differences in time. So again, a futures market is delivered theoretically sometime in the future, and cash prices today. If I haul my grain into the elevator today, this is the price I get. We got location differences. Okay, depending upon where you are in the country and where the grain is going to be moved to, you can have differences in price, right? The price in Vancouver is going to be very different than the price in Saskatoon, just because of logistics. Quality. Now here's one of the key things. For a futures market contract, quality is all specified. It never changes. So the contract is for a fixed quality as well as a fixed quantity. So the futures market, as prices change up and down for the futures price, they don't care, they could care less about quality. So if you've got a lot of bushels and very low quality, like we had a couple years ago in the United States, the futures market really didn't change much because we had the bushels. It was the cash market that made the rapid adjustments. And it was all through the discounting system. So obviously if you have low quality wheat, that basis, that spread is going to be much different. Okay? Risk obviously influences profit margins. The higher the risk, the more the margin. Especially what happens locally. Local competition, supply and demand. So if you've got two elevators right next to across the street from each other, you're going to have a little competition between them? They're shaking their head, no. Okay, let me change the scenario. Let's say you had a canola crusher and you got an elevator that's doing an export market bid. You're going to have some competition between those guys for canola? Sure. Now the two elevators are probably shipping to the same point anyway. That's why the guy over here is saying, no, we're not going to see any competition. That's why I changed my example. So if you're in canola, if you're in an area that has a crushing plant right next to you, that basis probably will be a bit better, a bit more of an advantage, right? The other thing is there's difference in market participants. Anybody hear of these nasty guys called the fund traders? F-U-N-D? Not fun, F-U-N. They're fund, F-U-N-D. Anybody heard of those nasty guys? Do they operate in the cash market? They could care less about the cash market. All they're worried about is what's happening in the futures market. So we can see some things happening in the futures up here. Futures can go up like crazy and the cash market might not change much just because of what those guys are doing. And again, what happens then? It changes the basis. It changes that spread. Okay? So again, if we were to take this chart and now instead of graphing the prices as they move together, we just we look at the difference. So let's look at the difference between the nearby futures, which is the futures contract that's closest to today's date, okay, and the cash price, that difference right there. If we were to plot that difference, what do you think that looks like? Something like that. Now this is an extreme case. This is actual numbers, these are real live numbers, but it's an extreme year. So let me talk about this for just a second. In the middle of harvest in 2010, this is in Minot, North Dakota, the cash price was $1.40 below the futures price. A couple months later, in April, May, basically when everybody's out there planting and nobody wants to haul grain, the cash price was $1.60 over the futures price. That's a $3 per bushel change. Now, depending upon what you do from a marketing standpoint and what tools you use, what strategies you have used, what contracting strategies you have, you can gain a big chunk of that. Another way of looking at that is there is an incentive right there to store your grain. What it's saying right back here is, you know what? The cash market doesn't want any more grain. We got all kinds of grain flowing. You know what? Put it in a bin. We'll pay you for it later. And then by the time it reached into the middle of February, January, February, nobody wants to haul grain because it's like 80 below out and 40-mile-an-hour winds and you got 6 feet of snow in front of your grain bins. Or you get into spring's work, nobody wants to haul grain. All of a sudden the cash market's screaming for more grain to flow. Right? So if we know these trends, if we know these changes, we can use the right tool at the right time and actually capture a big chunk of that. Now if you use the wrong tool, you're still leaving money on the table. I'm almost done, I promise. And we'll open up for questions. This is a cheat sheet. I love this cheat sheet. I have spent the whole day talking about this cheat sheet. It was originally put together by a guy named Dr. John Ferris out of Michigan State. It's about 20-some years old, almost 30 years old now. In its first form, it didn't look this nice and pretty. He worked on this for several years before he finally got it right. Okay, Jake Ferris is retired right now, but I love this. Because what it does is it says, what do you think is going to happen to the futures market? Do you think the futures price is going to go up or going to go down? What do you think is going to happen to the basis or that spread? Do you think the cash price is going to catch up to the futures price, like over here? Or do you think the cash price is going to spread further from the futures price, which is over there? And depending upon what you think is going to happen, each of these quadrants, what Jake Ferris did was he said, okay, in this environment, these are the futures-based contracts that work the best. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that if you pick one of these and you're up here, you're not going to get completely blown out of the water. It's just you're probably leaving some money on the table. Okay, so let me talk again, very briefly, let me just talk about this. To go through this in really detail and make sure that you understand what's going on takes a little bit longer. But I want you to be exposed to it. I'll be happy to share this stuff with everybody. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about copying it all down. I'll be happy to share it. So let's talk about this. Why do I like this matrix? Because it includes cash only. If all you want to do is cash market stuff like you've always done in the past, you don't want to use the futures, you don't want to use the contracts, it still works. It tells you that, you know what, you've got choices, but they're not very big. But it still tells you what works at best in what environment. It also talks about what futures and option strategies work best. So if you want to deal with a broker and go directly into the futures market, you can do that. And here's what you should do. The interesting thing, though, is if you want to work with a contract with the local elevator, instead of using a broker to use the futures market, you can do that too. And it shows you and tells you which one of these contracts works best. It also helps explain why certain contracts work really good one year and they stink the next. Okay, I get a lot of frustrated farmers calling me saying, "Man, I tried this particular contract last year. It didn't work for crud. I'm never going to do that again." I said, "You know what? Maybe you picked the wrong tool at the wrong time." It also explains why basis is important. How do you capture some of that $3 moves that I showed you? How do you capture part? I can't get you all $3. That's your sheer luck. But I could probably get you half of that. Would you be interested in $1.50 bushel? Yeah, that's the difference between profit and loss in many years, trust me. It also talks about the difference in risk exposure. Because if you're going to deal, I know there's going to be a lot of marketing services available, and most of the marketing services available are actually very good. And I know, at least in North Dakota, I know most of those folks, and they do a very good job. But some of their strategies are higher risk than other strategies. And you as a farmer have to understand which ones are high risk and which ones are not. So I just want to go through one or two and then I'll stop. And help me with time, make sure I stay on. Okay. So let's look at this. I just want to show you a couple quick uses. So let's say we're over here, where the futures price is here, the cash price is here, and we think the futures price is going to slowly drift up. What do we do if we think that's going to happen? Look at the top one. Store. Or, if you want to, you can forward contract. Say, I can't deliver right now today, but I'd like to in the next several weeks. Sign a forward contract. You guys know how to do that? We got that one figured out, right? We've been doing that for a couple thousand years. Let's look at another one. What happens if you don't have enough storage space? Okay, it's the tail end of harvest, your bins are full, and all of a sudden you don't have enough grain storage for all the, you had a good year. You don't have enough storage space. What do? Well, delayed pricing contract. Anybody tried one of those? You know, ever heard of that? Delayed pricing contract? Because we have a futures market, elevators are willing to do this. What we mean is, you as a farmer deliver the grain. Okay? They don't have, they're not going to pay you to store it, or you don't have to pay to store it. But the kicker is, you transfer title to the grain to them. Basically now they own it legally. The difference is you haven't locked in the price yet. Okay? Later on then, when prices improve, let's say it's a month later, you say, you know what, I want to sell today, even though the grain's already gone. Because the elevator has title to it, they can take it, put it in a rail car, and ship it out whenever they want to. Okay? The basis is, the futures price is not established, basis is not established. There's a small fee for writing these, and the elevator's going to charge you a little bit, but it's usually much less than storage. The kicker is this. Here's the risk. You as the farmer are an unsecured creditor, which means if that company goes bankrupt or has financial troubles, get to the end of the line. Okay, so it has advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. One more and then I'll quit. Let me talk about this one, basis contract. So let's say that we got some news coming out. I'm going to pick on a current topic in the wheat market is that the European community or EU may have, in particular France, really dry spring coming. Concerned about winter kill. Futures price may take off and go absolutely nuts. Okay? Because all these nasty speculator guys coming in the market. But you know what? Because it's a futures, we don't know if this is going to happen. Futures market takes off, cash market kind of lags behind, really doesn't do much. How do we capture this potential improvement in the futures market if we want to price something today? One of them is a basis contract. Essentially what we do is we lock in this. We go to the elevator and say, I want to lock in today's basis, and I want to deliver this grain in about 2 or 3 weeks after this big run-up in prices. So how do we do that? Well, it is a contract. We lock in this basis, but we have not locked in the futures price. We just lock in that spread. So we lock in, let's say, 60 cents under. Then as the futures market rallies, when you say, today I want to sell my grain, they take that futures price, they minus the 60 cents you have in the contract, that's your sale price. Okay, so the farmer chooses the futures price later, the basis is locked into the contract. So what have you done? Essentially what you've done is lock in this, as the futures price goes up like that, you subtract that out and your cash price is up here instead of way down here. Okay? Without the futures market, I don't know of an elevator in the country that would be willing to offer one of those. And I can go through and on and on and on. There's lots of different ways. I don't want to overwhelm people because there's a lot of different things we can talk about. So with that, I am going to quit. There is my contact information. And I know these guys have ways to get a hold of me as well. So if you think of something on the drive home or you're saying, what the heck was this crazy guy from North Dakota talking about? You can send me an email or give me a call. I'll be happy to try and talk with you about it. Thank you.